26 years. Not 26 years in prison. Not 26. A child born in the year she was first taken away could have grown up entirely, married, had children of her own, and buried a parent before she was ever free again. That is the length of time we are talking about, not a sentence handed down after a trial. A woman was simply taken and kept because the city of New York had decided her body was a danger to everyone else's. She did try to fight it. In 1909, her lawyer stood before two judges and asked a plain question. Can the state lock up a person who has never been charged with a crime and hold her indefinitely because of what her body might do to somebody else? The judges said yes. They said it was legal, and the woman the newspapers had already started calling Typhoid Mary went back to her island. This is the record behind that nickname. The court case almost nobody quotes. The men identified doing exactly what she was accused of doing, who kept their freedom while she lost hers, and the particular, specific cost of being the first person a frightened city decided it needed to make an example of. Before we go back to 1883, to a teenage girl stepping off a boat into New York Harbor with nothing but the clothes on her and a country full of kitchens that needed running, one small thing. If you want more history like this, subscribe. There is plenty more coming. Now, 1900, a kitchen in a rented summer house on Long Island's North Shore. Nobody standing in that kitchen has any idea what is about to start. Mary Mallon arrived in the United States as a teenager, one face inside the enormous wave of Irish emigration that had been crossing the Atlantic for decades by the time she made the trip herself. She was born on the 23rd of September, 1869, in Cookstown, in County Tyrone, a farming district with little to offer a young woman beyond the same life her mother had lived. In 1883, at around 14 years old, she crossed the Atlantic aboard a steamship called the Ethiopia and landed in a city where she knew almost no one, moving in first with an aunt already living there. She had no family fortune waiting for her in New York, no trade certificate, no letter of introduction to a respectable employer. What she had was a country full of households that needed someone to run their kitchens, and whatever nerve it takes to cross an ocean alone at that age, with nothing else to fall back on. Domestic service was, for a woman standing exactly where she stood, close to the top of what was actually available. A housemaid earned little and worked every hour under someone else's constant eye. A laundress worked herself raw over a washtub for even less than that. A cook, if she was any good, earned more than either, could move between households on the weight of her own name rather than a fixed position, and kept something genuinely rare for a single immigrant woman in this era. A measure of independence inside a system built to give her almost none. By every account left behind by the people who employed her, Mary Mallon was very good at this work. She was known, across a fairly narrow circuit of wealthy Manhattan families and their Long Island summer houses, as a capable, efficient, no-nonsense cook, the kind of employee a household could rely on through an entire season without one complaint about the food reaching the dining room. That reputation deserves a moment, because it sits at the exact opposite end of the reputation she would carry for the rest of her life, and for a long time after it. The families who paid her wages were satisfied customers. They wrote her references. Some of them asked her back the following summer. This was not a small thing to have built. An Irish immigrant woman in this period lived inside open, printed prejudice that most Americans today would find shocking to see reproduced. Newspaper cartoons mocked Irish domestic servants as ignorant, dirty, and prone to drink. Help-wanted advertisements sometimes carried the line, plainly, "No Irish need apply," printed without any need to explain itself. And yet Mary Mallon was standing inside one of the only doors that had actually been left open to her. By 1855, 4 out of every 5 domestic servants working in New York City were Irish-born. By 1900, more than half of all Irish-born women anywhere in the country were working in domestic service, and Irish women and their American-born daughters together made up close to half of every domestic servant in the entire United States. It was, in other words, close to the default occupation assigned to an entire national group of women, mocked constantly in print by the very households that depended on it completely. Mary Mallon built a working life directly inside that hostility. One summer contract at a time, one satisfied family at a time, across roughly a decade, before anyone in New York had ever heard her name attached to anything except good cooking. By 1900, she was in her early 30s, unmarried, self-supporting, and moving inside a fairly small, fairly wealthy circuit of employers, the kind of families who could afford both a private cook and a rented summer house away from the heat and disease of the city in July and August. That circuit, reconstructed almost entirely after the fact by a man who had never met her socially, is what the surviving record actually gives us of her early American life. Not a diary, not a bundle of letters home to Ireland, a list of addresses, dates, and employers. Most of it pieced together only years later, once somebody went looking for a pattern that none of the families living inside it had ever noticed on their own. County Tyrone in the 1870s and 1880s was farming country, still living in the long economic shadow of the famine decades that had emptied entire townlands across Ireland a generation earlier. A young woman with no land of her own and no dowry to speak of had a narrow set of choices in front of her. Stay and hope to marry into a farm, go into service for a landowning family nearby, on terms she would never control, or cross the ocean, the way so many of her neighbors already had, toward a country that at least offered wages in exchange for the same kind of work she would have done at home for almost nothing. The crossing itself, for a passenger in her situation, meant steerage, the cheapest deck on the ship, crowded, poorly ventilated, and often the first place a contagious illness could move quickly through dozens of people confined together for a week or more at sea. There is no surviving record of Mary Mallon's own crossing, beyond the fact that she made it, arrived, and by all appearances, arrived healthy. What she stepped into on the other side was a city already full of countrywomen doing exactly what she was about to do, filling the kitchens and nurseries of families with more money than any of them would likely ever hold themselves. It took her the better part of a decade, moving from position to position, before she reached the small, wealthy circuit of Manhattan and Long Island families, where the record eventually finds her clearly enough to trace, by every measure available. That decade was an ordinary immigrant working life, undocumented in any real detail, unrecorded except in the barest employment terms, exactly like thousands of other young Irish women doing the same work in the same city at the same time. The pattern, as far as the record can trace it, began in the closing years of the 1890s, and it repeated itself, quietly, for roughly 7 years, before a single person connected what was actually happening. From 1897 to 1900, she cooked for a family in Mamaroneck, north of the city. No one in the household or its staff fell ill while she worked there, a fact worth noting now because it will matter later. It was only in September of 1900, 10 days after a guest arrived to stay with the family, that a single case of typhoid fever appeared, in that visitor, not in the household itself. From 1901 into 1902, she worked for a family in Manhattan for 11 months. In December of 1901, the household's laundress was admitted to a hospital with typhoid fever. In the summer of 1902, she was hired by a prominent New York lawyer's family for their season at Dark Harbor on the coast of Maine. Before the summer ended, 4 members of that family and 5 members of its household staff had all come down with the same disease. In 1904, she took a position at a wealthy merchant's summer estate at Sands Point, on Long Island's North Shore, owned by a man named Henry Gilsey. 4 of the servants working alongside her that season fell ill with typhoid before the household understood what it was dealing with. In the fall of 1906, she cooked for a family at their home in Tuxedo Park, north of the city. Within 2 weeks of her arrival, the household's laundress was sick with typhoid. Oyster Bay in 1906 sat inside a stretch of the Long Island shoreline that would soon be known, only half admiringly, as the Gold Coast, a run of waterfront towns where the country's wealthiest industrial families were, in these very years, building more than 1,000 private estates between them, some the size of small colleges. The Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, the Astors, and dozens of families of similar fortune summered along that same shoreline, in a world later fixed permanently in American memory by a novel about the parties happening just down the water from where Mary Mallon was quietly doing the cooking. That same summer, on the 4th of August 1906, she was hired as the new cook for the family of Charles Henry Warren, president of a Manhattan bank and a personal banker to one of the era's greatest fortunes, who had rented a large yellow house with a wide porch at Oyster Bay on Long Island's North Shore for the season. Within weeks, 6 of the 11 people living in that house, family and staff together, had fallen ill, beginning with the Warrens' own daughter on the 27th of August. She was hit hardest of all, running a high fever with a slowed pulse, nosebleeds, and the same rose-colored rash across her stomach that marked the disease in nearly every case. Every one of the 6 who fell ill in that house that summer eventually recovered. Not every household Mary Mallon passed through was going to be so fortunate. By November of that year, she had moved on to a Park Avenue household. In January of 1907, a chambermaid there came down with the disease. The family's own daughter fell ill alongside her and did not survive. 7 households, 22 people made sick across all of them, by the count eventually assembled. At least 1 confirmed death in that initial tally. A young woman in a Park Avenue house who had done nothing except live somewhere Mary Mallon happened to be cooking. This was also a moment when the entire country's attention had turned, with unusual intensity, toward public health and the conditions poor and working people actually lived in. A photojournalist named Jacob Riis had spent the 1890s forcing wealthier Americans to look directly at the overcrowded, airless tenement housing that immigrant families were packed into. And reformers like Lillian Wald and Lawrence Vaylor had spent these same years pushing through new laws requiring more light, air, and sanitation inside those buildings. Public health, in other words, was no longer treated as a private matter between a family and its doctor. It had become a subject of national reform politics, argued about in newspapers and legislatures alongside child labor and factory safety. Mary Mallon's own case would land squarely inside that same reform energy a few years later, though on the opposite side of the ledger from the one Rees and Wald had spent their careers fighting for. Much of that reform effort had a specific name and a specific document behind it. A young reformer named Lawrence Vailor served as secretary of the New York State Tenement House Commission, convened in 1900, and the law it produced the following year, the Tenement House Act of 1901, required for the first time that every tenement apartment in the city have its own toilet, running water, and at least one window opening onto open air rather than an airless interior shaft. Vailor worked closely with Rees on a public exhibition of tenement photographs and models that helped build the political support the law needed to pass, and he went on to found a national organization, the National Housing Association, that pushed the same reforms into housing codes across dozens of American cities well beyond New York. None of that legislation touched Mary Mallon's own situation directly. She never lived in a tenement herself, and her case had nothing to do with housing law, but it shows the general climate she was about to walk into, a public already being taught, deliberately and systematically, to see disease as something that spread through specific, correctable, provable conditions, rather than simply through bad luck or bad air. A parallel campaign was already reshaping how the city thought about its children's food supply. A department store owner named Nathan Strauss had spent his own money since the early 1890s opening a chain of milk distribution stations across the city, selling pasteurized milk for a few cents a bottle and giving it away free to families who could not pay even that. The results were difficult to argue with. Of roughly 20,000 children fed on his pasteurized milk over one 4-year stretch, only a handful died, at a time when close to a quarter of all babies born in the city failed to reach their first birthday. By the time Josephine Baker's own Bureau of Child Hygiene was doing its work, a decade later, the idea that a specific, treatable contamination in an ordinary daily food, milk in Strauss's case, cooking in Mary Mallon's, could be quietly killing children without anyone noticing, was no longer a fringe theory. It was becoming the basic, working assumption of an entire generation of American public health reform. None of this happened in a city that treated typhoid as a distant or minor threat. In the decades spanning 1898 to 1907, more than 630 New Yorkers died of the disease, out of thousands of recorded cases, and the city's death rate from typhoid ran meaningfully higher than most major cities in Europe at the time. Getting typhoid in this era did not mean a bad week in bed. The fever climbed slowly, often over the first 10 days, was frequently accompanied by a dull, constant headache, a spotting of small rose-colored marks across the abdomen, and a swelling of the spleen a doctor could feel through the skin. Without any effective drug treatment available, because none existed yet, a case ran 4 to 6 weeks from first symptom to whatever resolution the body could manage on its own, and killed somewhere between 1 in 12 and 1 in 8 of the people who caught it. A family that heard the word typhoid attached to their own house in 1900 or 1906 was not hearing an inconvenience. They were hearing a month-long vigil with real odds of a funeral at the end of it. None of these families, living through their own individual outbreak, had any reason to connect it to any of the others. They did not know each other. Some of them never learned the cook's name at all, since domestic staff in this era often moved through a household's memory as a function rather than a person. Nobody thought to ask what she had actually served, because in 1900, in 1902, in 1906, almost nobody in American medicine believed a person could carry a dangerous disease inside their own body while feeling and appearing perfectly well. That belief was not stubbornness. It was the honest state of the science at the time, For most of the 19th century, doctors on both sides of the Atlantic had generally explained epidemic disease through something called miasma theory, the idea that sickness spread through a kind of bad air rising off decaying filth, rather than through any specific living organism passed from one body to another. It was only in the decades just before Mary Mallon's own birth that a French chemist named Louis Pasteur had begun proving, through careful laboratory experiment, that microscopic organisms, not foul air, were responsible for fermentation, decay, and, by direct extension, disease. A German physician named Robert Koch built directly on that foundation, developing rigorous laboratory methods for isolating a single bacterium and proving, beyond doubt, that it alone caused a specific illness. Germ theory itself, in other words, the very idea that a specific germ could be traced to a specific disease, was barely one full generation old by the time Mary Mallon was standing in the Warrens' kitchen. The specific idea of a healthy carrier, a person harboring a live, transmissible bacteria without ever showing a single symptom of the illness it caused, was only just beginning to be argued over by researchers in Europe. The German bacteriologist Robert Koch had only put the idea in front of his own profession in a lecture at the end of 1902, arguing that investigators chasing an outbreak needed to start looking for symptom-free carriers rather than only the visibly sick. Even in Germany, the idea was barely out of its own infancy. A large study across 11 bacteriological stations in the southwest of the country, examining close to 500 confirmed cases in the years just before, found several dozen patients still quietly shedding the bacteria weeks after their fever had broken, and a handful still doing it months later. A single woman in Strasbourg, identified as a carrier in 1906, had recovered from her own bout of typhoid a full decade earlier, and had apparently been carrying it in silence the whole time. In a rented Long Island kitchen the following year, half a world away, none of that research had traveled yet, and it was not even a question anyone present knew enough to ask. Even as that research was still working its way into professional conversation, a separate line of science was already moving toward making much of this argument obsolete. A British bacteriologist named Almroth Wright had spent the final years of the 1890s developing a vaccine against typhoid fever itself, testing it first on himself and a handful of soldiers before pushing the British War Office to inoculate troops being sent to fight in South Africa. The War Office allowed only a voluntary program. A small fraction of the men accepted it, and typhoid went on to kill more British soldiers in that war than enemy fire did. It took the opening of an even larger war, more than a decade later, for the lesson to fully land. On the eve of the First World War, with Lord Kitchener's direct backing, Britain finally made typhoid inoculation mandatory for its soldiers, and manufactured something like 10 million doses in a matter of months. The American military adopted a mandatory vaccination program of its own within a few years of Mary Mallon's own second confinement. None of this touched her case directly. She was a carrier, not a source of infection through contaminated water or crowded barracks. And no vaccine existed that could clear a carrier's own body of the bacteria once it had taken hold. But it marks, quietly, the moment the disease she carried stopped being an unstoppable force of nature for at least one large population, soldiers, even while the city's own health department was still deciding it had no better tool for a single civilian cook than an island in the East River. One dish kept surfacing in the households that remembered enough detail, years later, to describe her cooking with any precision. A cold, homemade ice cream, finished with fresh peaches cut directly into it after the ice cream itself had already been frozen. It was, by several accounts, something of a specialty of hers, a dish families specifically requested and remembered fondly. It was also, as would only become clear much later, close to an ideal way to move a bacterial infection into a household completely undetected. Nothing about it was ever cooked after her hands touched the peaches. Whatever those hands carried went directly into the dessert and directly onto the family's table. There was no monster in any of these 7 years, no nickname, no newspaper story, no public fear. There was simply a good, reliable, well-liked cook, moving from house to house on the strength of her own reputation, carrying something inside her body that neither she nor a single family who ever employed her had any way of knowing was there. Consider, for a moment, what running one of these kitchens actually meant in practical terms. A cook in a house like the Warrens' rented Oyster Bay summer home would rise before the rest of the household, light the stove, and begin planning a full day of meals for a family and its live-in staff, often 8 or 10 people counting the household help alone. She managed the icebox, the root cellar, the deliveries of meat and produce arriving fresh each morning, and she did all of it largely unsupervised, because a lady of the house in this period rarely set foot in her own kitchen at all. That autonomy is exactly what made Mary Mallon valuable, and it is exactly what made her invisible. Nobody watched her work closely enough to notice anything, because nobody watching her work closely enough was ever really part of the arrangement. The wages tell their own quiet story. A live-in cook of Mallon's caliber could expect to earn something in the range of $20 to $30 a month in this period, considerably more than a housemaid's 10 or 12, and more still than a laundress scraping by on day work. It was not wealth. It was, for an unmarried immigrant woman with no property and no family money behind her, something close to security, provided the work kept coming, and provided no employer ever had a reason to send her away without a reference. This was also the era of a very particular kind of American anxiety, one that filled newspaper columns and women's magazines throughout the 1890s and into the new century. Editors called it, without much subtlety, the servant problem, a running complaint from wealthy households about the supposed unreliability, dishonesty, and poor hygiene of the immigrant women who ran their kitchens and nurseries. Mary Mallon spent her entire working life being read by the very society pages that would later turn her into a monster, as exactly the kind of woman that anxious print culture already assumed was suspect. She simply had not yet given anyone a specific reason to point directly at her. The man who finally connected these 7 outbreaks into a single pattern was named George Soper, a sanitary engineer, not a physician, hired by the owner of that rented Oyster Bay house to solve one specific, practical problem. If nobody could explain why 6 of the 11 people in his property had fallen ill that August, he was never going to be able to rent the house out again the following summer. Soper worked the case the way an engineer approaches a mechanical failure, rather than the way a doctor approaches a patient. He tested the water supply and ruled it out. He examined the household's supply of shellfish and ruled that out as well, a suspicion that was not paranoia on his part. Contaminated shellfish, oysters especially, were a genuine and recurring source of typhoid outbreaks in this exact era, and the danger was real enough that, roughly 2 decades later, a single winter's supply of oysters harvested near untreated sewage outlets on Long Island and shipped out across the country in refrigerated rail cars caused an outbreak of its own, sickening around 1,500 people nationwide and killing about 150 of them, a disaster serious enough that it led directly to the creation of the country's first coordinated national shellfish safety program. Because typhoid typically takes 10 to 14 days to develop after exposure, he was able to narrow the likely window of infection down to a matter of days in late August, and then he worked backward through everyone who had touched food or drink in that house during exactly that window. That search led him to the household's newest hire, a cook brought on only weeks before the outbreak began, who had already left the family's employment by the time Soper started asking questions. Her name was Mary Mallon. From that single lead, Soper did something almost nobody else standing in his position would have thought to attempt. Rather than stopping once he had identified her role in the Oyster Bay case, he went looking for every other family she had ever cooked for, one by one. Working from household staffing records and personal recollection, he traced her back through Tuxedo Park, through Park Avenue, through Dark Harbor, Maine, through Manhattan, through Mamaroneck, all the way back to 1897, and one by one, he found the same shape repeating itself, a new position, a cluster of typhoid cases within a matter of weeks. Her departure, sometimes before the household even connected the illness to anything at all. He was assembling, essentially with his own two hands and a notebook, an epidemiological case against a single, specific, living person, years before American law or American medicine had any real framework for what a case like that would even mean. By March of 1907, Soper believed he had enough. He went to find her in person at the Park Avenue house where she was then employed, and asked her directly, by his own later written account, for samples of her blood, her urine, and a stool sample, so that the theory forming in his notebook could actually be tested in a laboratory. He described her reaction as immediate and furious. She did not believe for a moment that she was carrying anything. She had never once been sick with typhoid fever herself, not for a single day in her life, and as far as she understood the conversation, a stranger had simply walked into the kitchen where she worked and accused her, without a shred of proof she could see or feel, of poisoning the families who employed her. By his own telling, she came at him with a carving fork still in her hand, and he left the house without a single sample. Soper never really let go of the case, even decades later. He went on to serve as an army officer during the First World War, studying how influenza tore through crowded military camps during the 1918 pandemic, and later spent several years as managing director of the organization that would eventually become the American Cancer Society. He died in 1948 at 78 years old. 9 years before his death, in 1939, he sat down and wrote a long retrospective essay for a New York medical journal called The Curious Career of Typhoid Mary, revisiting the entire case in his own words, more than 3 decades after he had first knocked on the Warren family's kitchen door. That essay remains, to this day, one of the primary documents historians rely on for his own side of the story, written by a man who spent the rest of his professional life being remembered for one single investigation, however many other outbreaks and epidemics he went on to help contain. It is worth sitting with that moment for longer than the anecdote usually gets, because the surviving record genuinely allows more than one honest reading of it. It can be read as a guilty woman refusing, violently, to be caught. It can just as easily be read as exactly what almost any person might do if a stranger walked into the one room where they had built their entire professional reputation and told them, with no visible evidence at all, that their own body was a weapon that had already killed a child in a house down the street. This was, worth remembering, the exact same period in which the American public was already unusually primed to be afraid of what was quietly ending up in its food. Upton Sinclair's novel about the Chicago meatpacking industry had appeared the year before, in 1906, and its descriptions of what actually went into sausage and canned meat had done less to convince readers of the exploitation Sinclair had actually set out to expose, and considerably more to convince them their own dinner table might be a source of hidden danger. Sinclair himself would later put it more bluntly than any critic managed to. He said he had aimed at the public's heart, and by accident hit it in the stomach. That same year, under public pressure the novel helped generate, the federal government passed the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, the first real national framework for policing what the country ate. A cook, silently carrying a fatal disease into wealthy households without anyone's knowledge was, in other words, exactly the kind of invisible contamination story an American reader in 1907 had already been primed for months in advance to believe. Soper published his findings the following year, in 1907, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, laying out the 7 household outbreaks in full clinical detail. He titled the paper, with the same flat, procedural language he used throughout his own career, "The Work of a Chronic Typhoid Germ Distributor," a title that described her, in print, for the first time, not as a patient or a suspect, but as a mechanism, a distributor, a piece of infrastructure moving disease from one household to the next. The clinical language of that title said, in its own quiet way, exactly how the health department was already beginning to think of her, years before a single judge weighed in on the question. It was that publication, and the professional conversation it set off, that produced the name history actually remembers her by. In 1908, the same medical journal and the doctors discussing the case at a professional gathering that year began referring to her, in print, as Typhoid Mary. The nickname was born in a medical publication describing a public health investigation, not in a courtroom and not from her own mouth, months before the health department itself had finished deciding what, legally, it was actually entitled to do with her. Soper himself was not a household name before this case, though he was already a fairly established figure inside his own profession by the time he reached the Warren house. 6 years earlier, he had been sent to Galveston, Texas, in the aftermath of the hurricane that had killed thousands of people and left the city in ruins, to help direct its sanitary reconstruction, work serious enough that it led directly to his appointment as a sanitary engineer for the New York City Department of Health in 1902. And in the year just before Oyster Bay, he had been called in by New York state authorities to help suppress a typhoid epidemic tearing through the city of Ithaca, an outbreak that killed 82 people, 29 of them Cornell University students, before it was brought under control. He had traced that epidemic to a contaminated creek feeding the town's water system, closed the sources, and helped force the construction of a proper filtration plant. He arrived at the Warren house, in other words, already carrying a real, tested reputation for finding the exact point where a city's plumbing, water, or food supply had quietly turned against the people relying on it. He had trained as an engineer, not a physician, and had built a reputation cleaning up specific, contained public health failures, the kind of work that rewarded exactly the method he brought to the Warren house in Oyster Bay. Rule out the obvious. Follow the timeline. Trust the pattern over the assumption. It was, by any fair measure, genuinely skilled investigative work, conducted years before American law enforcement or American medicine had a name for what he was doing. The contamination behind that Ithaca epidemic, once Soper traced it fully, turned out to have a distressingly simple source: A private water company had been racing to finish a new dam on one of the creeks feeding the city's supply, and the workers building it were living in a camp with a single outhouse standing only a few dozen feet from the creek itself, used constantly, with waste running down into the very water the city and university were drinking unfiltered. Soper had the camp's sanitation cleaned up, the outhouses relocated, and pushed the water company into finally building the filtration plant it had avoided for years on the grounds of cost. 1,300 people fell ill before the epidemic finally burned itself out. It was, in miniature, the same lesson Mary Mallon's own case would soon repeat, at the level of one household rather than an entire town. An invisible contamination, moving through something as ordinary as drinking water or a dish of ice cream, killing people who never saw it coming and never understood, until someone went looking hard enough, exactly what had actually reached them. The actual solution to typhoid fever, as it turned out, had nothing to do with finding and confining every last carrier. In 1908, a physician named John Leal, working for the water utility supplying Jersey City, New Jersey, made a decision that would matter far more to the disease's overall death toll than anything that happened to Mary Mallon. Ordered by a court to deliver water that was, in the court's own words, pure and wholesome, and with only 90 days to do it, Leal added chlorine, in the form of powdered chloride of lime, directly to the city's water supply, the first time an American city had ever deliberately disinfected its drinking water at this scale. Jersey City's typhoid death rate had been running as high as 80 deaths for every 100,000 residents only a few years earlier. Within 5 years of Leal's decision, chlorination and filtration together had cut typhoid deaths in treated cities by more than 90%. By 1918, more than 1,000 cities across North America were disinfecting their water the same way, serving something like 33 million people. Nationally, the disease fell from around 100 cases for every 100,000 Americans in 1900 to under 34 by 1920, and to a small fraction of 1 case per 100,000 by the end of the century. Mary Mallon's kitchen was never the disease's real battlefield. The real battlefield was the water main and the filtration plant, and that war was already being won, quietly, by engineers rather than health inspectors, in the very years the city was deciding what to do with one cook. When Soper's findings reached the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1907, they arrived into a professional community that was still actively arguing over whether a healthy carrier was even a real, biologically coherent possibility, rather than a theoretical curiosity imported from European laboratories. Soper's paper, laying out 7 separate households and 22 identified cases traced to one specific woman, was treated by many of his peers as close to definitive proof that the theory was not merely possible, but already sitting inside American kitchens. The professional excitement around that discovery, and the nickname it produced the following year, mattered more to the doctors reading it than the fact that the woman at its center had never been asked a single question by anyone claiming medical authority before Soper arrived at her door, with a notebook already half full. Soper's private investigation became the New York City Health Department's official case within days of his failed visit to that Park Avenue kitchen. On March the 19th, 1907, a health inspector arrived at the same address, this time with police alongside her. Mary Mallon refused again, exactly as she had refused Soper, and this time refusal was not going to be accepted as an answer. The inspector on that visit was a young physician named Sarah Josephine Baker, who would go on to a long and genuinely significant career in American public health, and who left her own written account of the day. By her telling, Mallon fought so hard against being taken that Baker herself had to physically hold the woman down for the entire ambulance ride across the city, simply to get her to the hospital at all. This was not a quiet, cooperative removal. It was a physical struggle between two women, one of them a trained doctor acting under the authority of the city, the other a cook who still, by every indication, believed she was being taken for no reason at all. At Willard Parker Hospital she was tested and found to be carrying live typhoid bacteria, concentrated in her gallbladder. From there, she was transferred to Riverside Hospital on North Brother Island, a small island in the East River the city used to isolate people suffering from contagious disease. She had never been arrested. She had never been formally charged with anything. In the eyes of the criminal law, at that exact moment, she had committed no offense whatsoever, and she was going to live on that island, under the health department's authority, for as long as the department believed her presence there was necessary, with no fixed date attached to that sentence at all, because it was not, technically, a sentence. North Brother Island held a shifting population of patients, most of them there for a matter of weeks or months, suffering from tuberculosis, diphtheria, or other contagious illnesses that were expected to run their course one way or another. Mary Mallon was almost entirely unlike the people around her. She was not sick. She felt, by every account including her own, completely well. She could work, cook for the hospital staff, walk the island's grounds, and live what looked, from the outside, like an ordinary life in every respect except one. She could not leave, and no doctor on that island could tell her, honestly, when that would ever change. Because no doctor there had ever managed a case quite like hers before either. She spent close to 3 years inside that first confinement, for most of it with only a small fox terrier for company. In one surviving letter she asked, plainly, why she should be banished like a leper and forced to live in solitary confinement with nothing but a dog to talk to. During this same period, doctors on the island repeatedly urged her to agree to have her gallbladder removed, the organ where the bacteria appeared to be living, on the theory that taking it out might end her carrier status for good. She refused every time. Surgery in this period was a genuinely dangerous undertaking even for routine procedures. Survival was never guaranteed, and she did not, in any case, believe the diagnosis was real in the first place. It is worth noting, without using it to excuse anything that was done to her, that later carriers who did agree to the same operation often kept shedding the bacteria afterward anyway, which suggests her refusal cost her less certainty than the doctors urging it believed at the time. The reason her own gallbladder became the bacteria's long-term home has a fairly specific biological explanation, worked out more fully by later researchers than anyone possessed in 1907. The bacterium responsible for typhoid fever can survive for years inside gallstones and along the lining of the gallbladder itself, protected there from the immune system in a way it generally is not once it circulates through the rest of the bloodstream. A carrier's gallbladder continues quietly shedding live bacteria into the bile duct and from there into the digestive tract, without producing any of the fever, headache, or intestinal symptoms the same bacteria cause during an active infection elsewhere in the body. This is part of why removing the gallbladder surgically seemed, to the doctors treating Mary Mallon, like such an obvious solution, and part of why her own refusal frustrated them so deeply. It is also why, as already noted, the fix was never as reliable as they assumed. Later carriers who underwent the same operation sometimes kept shedding the bacteria from elsewhere in the digestive tract regardless, a finding that would have offered her own decision a scientific vindication her doctors were not yet in a position to give her. Letters she wrote during this period survive, and in them she insists, repeatedly, that she does not accept the diagnosis, that she believes she has been singled out with no justification, and that she wants her case heard, properly, in an actual court of law, by an actual judge, rather than decided quietly by a health department that had never had to answer to anyone for what it was doing to her. Eventually, in 1909, that is precisely what happened. Josephine Baker herself went on to become one of the most significant public health physicians of her generation. The following year, in 1908, she was appointed director of the city's brand new Bureau of Child Hygiene, the first agency of its kind anywhere in the country, and over the 15 years she ran it, New York City's infant mortality rate fell from roughly 144 deaths for every 1,000 live births down to around 66, cutting it by more than half. One of her smaller programs alone, a simple standardized dose of silver nitrate given to newborns, cut the number of infants blinded at birth in the city from roughly 300 a year to about 3. By 1918, 10 years into her tenure, the rate had already fallen to 88 deaths per 1,000, on its way to the 66 it would reach by the time she left the position. By the time she retired, New York had the lowest infant death rate of any major American city, and versions of her public health programs had been copied in dozens of states. Baker's public health career extended well beyond the years she spent chasing Mary Mallon through a Park Avenue kitchen. In 1910, she began organizing what she called Little Mothers' Leagues, training girls as young as 12, many of whom were already responsible for the informal care of younger siblings while their own mothers worked, in the basic mechanics of keeping an infant fed, clean, and safe. She fought her own battle for professional recognition a few years later, when New York University's medical school asked her to lecture on child hygiene, and she refused unless the university would actually admit her as an enrolled doctoral student, a status barred to women at the school at the time. The university held out for a year, failed to find any man who could teach the subject as well as she could, and finally opened its doors, making her, in 1917, the first person in the country of either sex to hold a doctorate in public health. She was, by her own account and by the account of nearly everyone who wrote about her, an openly gay woman living with a partner in an era that offered her no legal recognition or protection for that relationship whatsoever, and an outspoken suffragist besides. She retired from the health department after a long career, published her own memoir called Fighting for Life in 1939, 1 year after Mary Mallon's death, and lived out her own final years on a farm in New Jersey. It is worth remembering that the same public health apparatus that confined Mary Mallon for 26 years also produced Baker, a woman whose reforms are conservatively credited with saving tens of thousands of children's lives. The system was neither a simple villain nor a simple hero. It could do both of these things at once, because it was made of individual people making individual judgment calls, some of them bakers, and some of them the judges and commissioners who decided what to do with the cook she had once had to physically hold down in the back of an ambulance. She wrote about the day she confined Mary Mallon in her own memoir decades later, and her account does not read like a triumphant capture. It reads like a physician who understood, even at the time, that she was watching something without real precedent unfold, a woman being taken not for a crime, but for what her body carried, using police force normally reserved for people who had actually broken the law. North Brother Island itself, in 1907, was a small, quiet, heavily wooded strip of land in the East River, close enough to the Bronx shoreline to see the mainland clearly, far enough away that anyone standing on it was, for all practical purposes, removed from the life of the city entirely. Riverside Hospital's buildings sat among its own gardens and paths, more closely resembling a sanatorium than a prison in appearance, which made Mary Mallon's actual situation stranger still. She was not behind bars. She was behind water, on an island she could see across but never legally cross, held by a boundary the law had drawn around her rather than a wall. In late June of 1909, Mary Mallon's attorney, a lawyer named George Francis O'Neill, filed a writ of habeas corpus on her behalf, the oldest and most fundamental legal tool a person in America has for challenging their own detention. The argument at its center was straightforward. She had never been charged with a crime. She had never been convicted of anything, and she had already spent more than 2 years confined on an island with no fixed release date in sight. The state, her lawyer argued, had no legitimate legal authority to hold a person indefinitely on the theory that she might, someday, make somebody else sick. American law already had a long, if narrower, history of allowing the state to physically confine a person over a contagious disease. New York's own colonial government had built one of the country's first formal quarantine systems back in the 1750s, funded by a tax on every ship's passenger and crew member arriving at the port, aimed at ships suspected of carrying yellow fever or smallpox. Congress passed the country's first true national quarantine law in 1878, and by the time Mary Mallon's own case reached a courtroom, entire detention camps existed along the southern coast, purely to hold travelers coming from areas with active yellow fever outbreaks, until the incubation period had safely passed. Philadelphia had endured its own catastrophic epidemic in 1793, when yellow fever, carried in by refugees fleeing a slave revolt in the Caribbean, killed close to 5,000 people in a city of only 50,000 within a few months, one of the deadliest single epidemics in the country's entire history. The city had no meaningful quarantine system in place at the time, and the disaster directly produced one, a new board of health charged with inspecting incoming ships, and a dedicated quarantine hospital built at the mouth of the Delaware River a few years later, a building that still stands today as the oldest surviving quarantine structure in the country. That is the tradition Mary Mallon's own case grew out of. A system built, city by city, epidemic by epidemic, to stop a specific kind of threat, a ship, a border, a point of entry, at the moment it arrived, rather than a system built to manage a citizen already living quietly inside the country, carrying a threat no one else could see. What none of that older law had ever really addressed was a citizen, already living inside the country, confined not because of where she had traveled from, but because of an invisible condition inside her own body that produced no visible symptoms at all. Mary Mallon's hearing landed exactly in that gap. The hearing was heard before 2 judges in New York, and the health department's defense rested almost entirely on a single piece of legal precedent decided 4 years earlier. That precedent had nothing to do with typhoid, and nothing at all to do with a cook. It began with a Cambridge, Massachusetts pastor named Henning Jacobson, who refused a mandatory smallpox vaccination for himself and his son, citing a previous bad reaction, and was fined $5 under a city ordinance requiring every resident to be vaccinated or revaccinated. Jacobson fought the fine all the way to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that the government had no business forcing a medical procedure onto an unwilling body. In 1905, the court ruled against him, 7 votes to 2. Writing for the majority, Justice John Marshall Harlan held that a state's police power to protect public health could reasonably override an individual citizen's personal liberty, and that liberty, under the Constitution, had never been an absolute, unconditional right in the first place. The health department's attorneys argued that if a state could compel an otherwise healthy man to accept a needle in his arm for the benefit of everyone around him, it could certainly confine a woman who had already, demonstrably, infected multiple households with a fatal disease. In mid-July, the judges ruled against her. Her continued confinement, they found, was a legitimate exercise of the state's recognized public health powers. She had not been convicted of a crime because she had never actually been accused of one in the criminal sense at all. She was, in the eyes of this ruling, something American law had barely had to define with any precision before her specific case forced the question into an actual courtroom. A civil detainee, held not for anything she had done, but for what her own body was medically capable of doing to other people, for exactly as long as the state continued to believe that danger was real and ongoing. This is worth stating as plainly as possible, because the popular memory of Typhoid Mary skips straight past this entire chapter of the story. She did not simply vanish onto an island with no legal process attached to it whatsoever. She had a real hearing. She had a genuine, formally argued legal case made in her defense, built on the single most basic liberty protection English and American law offers a person. And a court, applying real, existing precedent, decided that her personal freedom mattered less than the city's documented fear of what she might still be carrying. That is a considerably more serious and a considerably more damning story than a woman being locked away with absolutely no due process at all. It means the law itself, examined carefully and argued by trained attorneys on both sides, came down against her, and did so using language that would go on to outlive her by more than a century. Newspapers covered the 1909 hearing closely, though rarely with much sympathy for the woman at its center. By this point, the Typhoid Mary nickname had already spread well beyond medical journals and into the general press, and much of the coverage treated her petition for release less as a serious civil liberties argument and more as the complaint of a dangerous woman trying to talk her way free. That kind of coverage was not incidental to her case. It was the water she was swimming in. New York in this period was in the middle of a ferocious newspaper circulation war, chiefly between Joseph Pulitzer's World and William Randolph Hearst's American and Journal, a rivalry so devoted to sensational, oversized headlines that the term used to describe it, yellow journalism, had entered the language only a decade earlier. A story like hers, a servant girl secretly poisoning the tables of the rich, fit that style of coverage perfectly, and the papers competing hardest for street sale readers had every commercial incentive to make her sound as monstrous as the language would allow. The New York American, one of the era's most widely read and least restrained papers, ran a piece in the middle of June that year, describing her as, in its own words, the most harmless and yet the most dangerous woman in America, and had already published an illustration showing her cracking human skulls into a frying pan like eggs. Even that same paper, only 10 days later, ran a second piece, asking its readers for a measure of pity for a lone woman with no relative or friend anywhere to turn to. The nickname and the sympathy were, apparently, not seen as contradictory. A reader could hold both at once, exactly the way the public health system holding her was managing to treat her both as a serious medical danger and as a woman with functionally no rights at all. That press treatment matters, because it shows how thoroughly the nickname had already done its work before the court ever ruled. The public reading about her case in 1909 was reading about a monster asking to be let loose, not a domestic servant asking a court to explain what crime she had actually committed. The legal argument and the popular story were, from this point forward, two entirely different accounts of the same woman, running side by side, and only one of them needed a courtroom to survive. Mary Mallon remained on North Brother Island for roughly another year after that ruling, until a change at the very top of the health department finally gave her an opening nobody had expected. In 1910, a new health commissioner named Ernst Lederle took over, and took a noticeably more sympathetic view of her specific situation than the officials who had come before him. He agreed to release her, on conditions written into a formal agreement she was required to sign before she could leave. The agreement itself was specific, and it was narrow. She would report to the health department on a regular schedule, so that her condition could continue to be monitored going forward. In practice, that regular schedule meant appearing before health department physicians every 3 months, submitting to a physical examination each time, and providing a stool sample so her carrier status could continue to be tracked in the department's own records. She also signed a written affidavit agreeing to take, in her own words, reasonable precautions against infecting others, language vague enough that it left almost the entire practical burden of proof on her own future conduct, rather than on any specific, defined standard the department was required to help her meet. And she would never again take employment as a cook for any household, under any circumstances. In exchange for those two promises, in February of 1910, after nearly 3 years confined on that island, she was finally allowed to walk free. It is worth sitting, for a moment, with exactly what that agreement asked of her in practical terms. Cooking was not simply a job Mary Mallon happened to be holding at the moment she was taken. As already established, it was close to the single best-paid line of work, realistically open to a woman standing in her position, the one trade in which she had spent close to a decade building a genuine, portable reputation, one that let her move between wealthy households almost entirely on her own terms rather than someone else's. The city was not, in any meaningful sense, simply releasing Mary Mallon back into her old life. It was releasing her into a version of freedom that had deliberately removed her only real path to a stable living, and it offered her nothing whatsoever to replace it. She did try, at least for a time, to live inside those terms. She took work as a laundress, one of the lower-paid trades genuinely available to a woman of her background, work that had never suited her the way cooking clearly had, and work that paid a fraction of what she had earned running someone else's kitchen. She reported to the health department as required, for a while, and then, gradually, over the years that followed, her contact with the department grew less regular. Her address became harder to track, and the one woman the city was specifically supposed to be keeping watch over quietly slipped out of view. Ernst Lederle, the commissioner who finally approved her release, was himself a bacteriologist by training, one of the first health commissioners in the city's history to actually understand the science at the center of her case, rather than simply reacting to the fear surrounding it. Born on Staten Island, trained at Columbia's School of Mines, he had already served one earlier term as health commissioner, before returning to the post in 1910. And he would go on, years after leaving city government, to found a small laboratory company that eventually grew into one of the country's major pharmaceutical manufacturers, later helping develop one of the earliest widely used antibiotics. That background likely explains some of his willingness to reconsider a confinement his predecessors had allowed to stretch on with no real review. It did not change the terms he was willing to offer her. The science might have made him more sympathetic to her situation. It did not make the city any more willing to let her near a stove again. A laundress in this period stood over a washtub and a mangle for 10 or 12 hours at a stretch, for wages that might run to $8 or $9 a month, against the 20 or more she had been able to earn running a wealthy household's kitchen. It was a demotion in every practical sense. A working woman of this era would have recognized instantly, a visible step down that anyone who had known her professionally in her cooking years would have noticed immediately. Here is the part of this story the popular version leaves out almost entirely, and it is the single piece that changes what kind of story this actually turns out to be. Mary Mallon was never the only healthy carrier of typhoid fever identified in New York City in this era. By the time historians later reconstructed the full public health record, the city's own health department had identified something in the neighborhood of 400 other healthy carriers across the following decades. Most of them, including several who continued working with food, were monitored, in some cases given alternative work. In at least some documented instances, even had part of their rent covered by the city, and were allowed to remain living freely inside their own communities. None of them were confined on an island for years at a stretch. None of them faced anything remotely close to what Mary Mallon was made to endure. One single case makes the comparison almost impossible to look past, a case worth returning to in its full detail in a moment. In 1922, a food handler named Tony LaBella was linked to typhoid outbreaks with a higher combined human toll than everything ever traced back to Mary Mallon. He was briefly confined by the authorities and then released back into ordinary life with nothing resembling the sentence Mary Mallon was, by that same year, already 15 years into. So the honest question sitting at the center of this case was never really whether the health department had the legal authority to confine a known carrier. The 1909 ruling had already settled that exact question, as far as the law itself was concerned, years before LaBella's case ever came to light. The honest question is why that authority landed with such extraordinary and lasting force on one specific woman, and so lightly, almost casually, on nearly everyone else ever identified doing precisely the same thing. The historian who has studied this case most closely, Judith Walser-Leavitt, argues the answer sits less inside medicine than inside exactly who Mary Mallon happened to be: a woman, unmarried, an immigrant, working class, with no husband, no family fortune, and no professional standing to speak on her behalf. Every one of those facts made her easier for a nervous public health bureaucracy to isolate, easier for a frightened city to distrust completely, and easier, in the end, for the wider public to simply accept as dangerous, in a way the surviving record simply does not show happening to any of the men identified doing the same thing beside her. This is not a certainty the documents can fully, finally prove. It is the strongest explanation the current evidence actually supports, and it is considerably harder to sit with than a simple, comforting story about a reckless cook who plainly deserved whatever she got. Some of those other carriers are barely names in a file today, workers the health department tracked quietly for years without any public record ever attaching a nickname to them at all. That quiet is itself part of the evidence. A system capable of managing 400 cases without headlines managed exactly one case as a folk legend, and the difference was never the science. It is worth adding, honestly, that the surviving record does not allow us to say the health department acted only out of prejudice or only out of genuine caution in any of these individual decisions. Public health officials in this period were working without modern legal guidance, without established protocols for exactly this kind of case, often making judgment calls under real pressure from a frightened press and a frightened public. The fairest reading is not that the department set out to persecute one woman while protecting others, but that an already uneven system full of untested assumptions about class, gender, and nationality produced an uneven result once it had to decide, case by case, whose freedom mattered enough to protect. 2 of those 400 other files deserve more than a passing mention, because they do not simply repeat the pattern, they sharpen it. Tony LaBella was a dairy worker, traced by the same kind of patient investigation Soper had once used, to an outbreak at an orphan asylum in Morris County, New Jersey. By most tallies, 72 children in that one institution fell ill, and 3 of them died. A second cluster, in Newark, added roughly 35 more cases and several more deaths. Accounts vary slightly on the exact final count, but every version agrees on the same basic shape. Well over 100 people sickened, several children among the dead. LaBella was an Italian immigrant who moved between dairy operations in the New York area, exactly the kind of food handling work the health department was, by then, supposed to be watching closely. He was arrested and brought before a court in Newark in October of that year. He signed an agreement strikingly similar to the one Mary Mallon had signed 12 years earlier. He would leave food service permanently, report to health authorities on a regular schedule, and provide samples so his condition could continue to be monitored. Here is where the 2 cases stop rhyming and start contradicting each other outright. Mary Mallon's first confinement, before any agreement was ever offered to her, ran close to 3 years. Tony LaBella, responsible for a demonstrably higher body count, was isolated for roughly 2 weeks before that agreement returned him to ordinary life. And when LaBella went back to food-related work anyway, in violation of the exact promise he had just signed, the result was not a second lifetime confinement. It was 35 more cases and 3 more deaths in Newark, and still no sentence resembling the 23 years Mary Mallon would serve for her own single violation of an almost identical agreement. The second file belongs to a bakery and restaurant owner named Alphonse Cotilles, a Belgian immigrant doing business in New York. Cotilles was identified as a carrier and formally banned from working inside his own kitchen. He kept working there anyway, in plain violation of that order, for long enough that the city eventually took him to court over it in 1924. The judge who heard his case did not send him anywhere. By the account that survives, the judge acknowledged openly that Cotilles represented a genuine danger to the public, and then handed down a suspended sentence rather than any form of confinement, reasoning, in the plainest possible terms, that a man could not legally be jailed on account of his own health. Cotilles had a wife and children depending on the income his bakery provided, and that fact appears to have weighed directly on the leniency he received. Set the 2 files side by side, and the pattern Judith Walser-Levitt describes stops being an abstract argument about bureaucratic inconsistency. It becomes a direct comparison. A married, property-owning businessman, caught knowingly breaking his own health restriction, walked out of a courtroom with a suspended sentence and his family's income intact. A single, working-class immigrant cook caught doing exactly the same thing. A woman with no husband, no property, and no one in a position of authority speaking on her behalf, spent the next 23 years of her life on an island in the East River. Nothing about the underlying medical risk explains that gap. Cotilles ran a bakery patronized by the public every single day. LaBella's carelessness had already killed 3 children in one institution before anyone in authority stopped him even briefly. The difference in how the law responded to each of them was never really about how dangerous any of them actually were. A third file complicates the picture further, and in a different direction than Labella and Cotil's. A German immigrant named Friedrich Morsch, who worked as a confectioner, was identified as a typhoid carrier and sent to North Brother Island in 1915, the same year Mary Mallon herself was returned there for her second and final confinement. Morsch was not released until 1944, 6 years after Mary Mallon had already died on that same island. By the length of confinement alone, his case actually rivals, and by some counts slightly exceeds, hers. That comparison, though, is where the resemblance ends. When the city finally released Morsch, it did not simply put him back on the street with a signed promise and nothing else, the way it had with Mary Mallon in 1910. It found him a position at a Brooklyn hospital, in work that did not involve food, and it paid his rent. He does not appear to have been given a public nickname. No newspaper ever drew him as a grinning skull frying human bones in a pan. No stage play or comic book ever borrowed his name. He was, by every indication in the surviving record, allowed to live out his release in a kind of ordinary obscurity that Mary Mallon was never once permitted. So the honest comparison is not simply that she was confined longer than everyone else, because Morsch's own file shows that is not quite true. The honest comparison is that she was confined under harsher conditions the first time, treated as a lifelong danger rather than a manageable case the second time, given no institutional support of any kind when she was finally released, and made, uniquely among every carrier the city ever identified, into a piece of American folklore that outlived her by nearly a century. Morsch's own long confinement on the same island is, if anything, a sign of just how quietly the health department could manage even its longest-running cases when the surrounding noise, the press coverage, the nickname, the public appetite for a villain never attached itself to the person at the center. For roughly 5 years after her release, Mary Mallon appears, as far as the surviving record shows, to have lived within the terms she had signed. Then, in 1915, a typhoid outbreak struck Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan. 25 people fell seriously ill. At least 2 of them died. When health investigators traced the outbreak back to the hospital's own kitchen, they found a cook working there, under the name Mrs. Mary Brown. It was Mary Mallon, cooking again, under a false name, doing the single job she had ever truly been good at, the exact job she had signed a formal agreement never to do again. There is no surviving record of what was actually going through her mind standing in that kitchen, and the honest position here is to say so plainly rather than invent an answer that simply sounds better in a story. It is possible to read this decision as proof that she had never truly accepted her own diagnosis and had simply resumed a life she believed, sincerely, she had every right to. It is equally possible to read it as the entirely predictable outcome of a woman with no other realistic way to support herself, 5 years into a bargain that had already taken her one real livelihood and replaced it with nothing. Both of those readings remain genuinely available inside the surviving record. Neither one is settled by it, and this narration will not pretend that it is. What is settled, beyond any dispute, is the consequence that followed. She was identified beyond any doubt this time, and she was returned to North Brother Island. The city was not interested, on this second occasion, in another hearing, another negotiated agreement, another conditional chance at freedom. She had broken the single condition attached to her release, and freedom of any kind was not going to be offered to her again. Sloan Maternity Hospital was, by design, exactly the kind of place where a typhoid outbreak could do the most damage in the least time. A facility full of new mothers and newborn infants with little natural resistance to build on. The outbreak alarmed the hospital's own doctors enough that they launched an internal investigation almost immediately, well before anyone suspected the connection to a case the city had already closed its file on years earlier. It was patient, methodical tracing, in the same spirit Soper had once used against her, that eventually matched her physical description and handwriting to the woman who had signed a release agreement in 1910 under her own real name. Mary Mallon spent the following 23 years of her life on North Brother Island. Added to her first confinement, that comes to a combined total of roughly 26 years spent on a small island in the East River, for a woman never once, in the whole of that time, convicted of any actual crime. For much of that second confinement, she took on real work around the hospital, earning the title of nurse by 1922. And from 1925 on, she was permitted inside the hospital's own laboratory, cleaning glassware and preparing samples. A strange and genuinely uncomfortable irony, given exactly what had placed her there in the first place. She lived in a small cottage on the hospital grounds, largely apart from the general patient population. In one letter to the same New York American that had helped make her famous, she described her situation in 5 words that outlasted almost everything else she ever said publicly. She had been, in her own phrase, a peep show for everybody. By several accounts left by people who encountered her in these years, she had become an isolated, guarded, private woman, and it is not difficult to understand why. The nickname that had followed her since 1908 had, by this point, grown into a piece of American folklore entirely separate from the actual living woman standing behind it. Newspaper cartoonists drew her as a grinning skull frying eggs over a stove, tossing tiny human skulls into a pan like breakfast. The name had long since outgrown the person it was attached to, and there was nowhere left on that small island for her to escape what it had turned her into in the public imagination. Even the island itself carried its own weight of tragedy by the time she returned to it in 1915. 9 years earlier, in June of 1904, a chartered passenger steamship called the General Slocum, carrying more than 1,300 members of a single Lower East Side church out for a summer excursion, most of them German immigrant women and children, caught fire on the East River. Its captain steered the burning vessel directly toward North Brother Island, hoping to beach it before it sank, and the ship ran aground on the island's own shore for close to an hour and a half before finally breaking free and going down nearby. By the time it was over, something close to 1,000 people were dead, making it, at the time, the worst single loss of life the city had ever recorded, a record it would hold for nearly a century. Survivors had been carried directly onto the island's own grounds in the disaster's immediate aftermath, the same grounds where Mary Mallon would live out most of the rest of her life. Mary Mallon was living out her second, longer confinement on a piece of ground the city already associated with sudden, undeserved loss, years before she ever arrived there herself. The disaster produced its own reckoning, though a narrow one. A federal investigation found that the ship's life preservers had rotted for years without inspection, that its fire hoses were rotten as well, and that the crew had never once run a fire drill. Of everyone connected to the ship, its owners, its inspectors, the manufacturer that had sold it defective safety equipment, only the ship's captain was ever convicted of anything. A jury found him guilty of criminal negligence in early 1906, and a judge sentenced him to 10 years of hard labor at Sing Sing prison, though he served only part of that sentence before receiving a presidential pardon several years later. The disaster did force a genuine, lasting change in the law itself. Congress rewrote the country's steamboat inspection rules in its aftermath, mandating fire drills, overhauling life-saving equipment standards, and tightening the inspection process the General Slocum had passed so easily, despite everything wrong with it. Many historians of the Lower East Side's German immigrant community also trace the neighborhood's rapid decline in the years just after the disaster directly to this one afternoon. Entire families gone at once, grief driving survivors uptown to a new neighborhood rather than staying among streets that could no longer be walked without remembering who was missing from them. It is a strange, quiet echo of Mary Mallon's own story. A disaster that killed roughly 1,000 people, producing exactly one convicted individual, and a raft of new regulation, while a woman who never killed anyone through malice or negligence at all was made to answer for her own case, alone, for 26 years, on the very shoreline where so many of that disaster's dead had first been brought ashore. Riverside Hospital itself had moved onto the island back in 1885, transplanted from an older quarantine site on what is now Roosevelt Island, and its original mission had been smallpox alone before the city widened its purpose to cover typhoid and, eventually, tuberculosis. During the major polio epidemic that struck New York City in 1916, the hospital treated a wave of children stricken with that disease as well, one more layer in the island's long, crowded history of being where the city sent whatever contagious threat it did not yet know how to manage anywhere else. The hospital kept expanding for decades after Mary Mallon's own death, adding its last major building, a dedicated tuberculosis pavilion, as late as 1943. In the years after the Second World War, the island took in returning veterans, and later still, it briefly served the city as a treatment center for heroin addiction, before the whole facility finally closed for good in 1963. Today, North Brother Island belongs to New York City's park system, set aside as a protected sanctuary for water birds, and the public is not permitted to set foot on it at all, except by special arrangement, usually escorted by a city parks employee for research or reporting purposes. The buildings Mary Mallon once lived and worked inside are still standing, slowly being reclaimed by the trees, on a small island most of the city that once feared her can no longer legally visit either. In 1932, she suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. She spent the final 6 years of her life largely confined to a bed inside that same small cottage, cared for by hospital staff, on the identical island that had already held her for a quarter of a century by that point. She died on November the 11th, 1938. An autopsy performed afterward found live typhoid bacteria still present inside her gallbladder, confirming, at the very end, that the original diagnosis Soper had chased down back in 1907 had been correct all along. She had, in fact, been a genuine carrier the entire time. Every year of her confinement, every year of her freedom, every year she spent insisting otherwise in her own letters. Counting every outbreak ever connected to her name, across the whole of her working life, from the first traceable household in the 1890s, through the Sloan maternity outbreak in 1915. Different tallies land in slightly different places, but the fullest estimates run as high as 57 cases and at least 3 confirmed deaths. Her funeral was held at a small Manhattan church a few days after her death. The newspapers covering that death noted, almost as an aside, that 237 other identified carriers were, at that exact moment in 1938, still living freely under the health department's own ordinary system of observation. somewhere in the city, a running count that would only grow as the decades went on toward the fuller historical tally of roughly 400. Not one of those 237 was on an island. That detail, printed in passing in a 1938 death notice, is in many ways the whole argument of this documentary compressed into one sentence. That single confirmed fact does not answer the actual questions this case raises. It never did. Being a real, documented carrier explains, fully and fairly, why the health department believed she posed a genuine risk to the public. It does not begin to explain why, out of every single carrier the city of New York ever identified across the following decades, she alone was made to pay for that risk with 26 years of her own life. A newspaper reporter who visited the island in her later years described a guarded, weary woman with little interest in discussing her own case, understandably worn down after decades of being asked the same questions by people who had already decided the answer before they arrived. She gave few interviews, and the ones that survive show a woman who never fully stopped insisting she had been treated unfairly, even as she lived out the final years of a life almost entirely defined by that one unresolved argument. Some later writers, working from hospital staff recollections, described her keeping largely to herself, tending a small garden near her cottage, one of the only forms of ordinary daily life still available to her inside a confinement with no scheduled end. She was buried at St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, in a grave that carries little beyond her own name and her 2 dates, more than 3 decades separating the day she first arrived on North Brother Island as a young woman still insisting, in her own handwriting, that a mistake had been made. So we return to exactly where we started, 26 years, longer, by most surviving records, than the average sentence handed down for manslaughter in this same era, served in full by a woman who was never once tried for anything of the kind. The record will not let us call her simply innocent. She was, in fact, exactly what George Soper's investigation said she was, a genuine healthy carrier of a disease that had already cost real families real grief, including at least one dead child, before anyone ever managed to trace it back to her kitchen. But the record also will not let us call this story finished at the moment that fact was confirmed, because roughly 400 other people, identified across the following decades, doing precisely the same thing she had done, were allowed to keep their jobs, their homes, and their freedom, while she alone was made to disappear onto a small island for most of the rest of her adult life. That is the actual shape of this story, once the nickname is set aside and the record is read on its own terms. Not a monster the law rightly stopped in her tracks, not an innocent woman destroyed for absolutely nothing. A single, specific person made to personally absorb the full weight of a public health system that did not yet know what to do with the fear a genuinely new kind of danger had created, and that weight fell on her, and almost nowhere else, with a severity the surviving record simply cannot explain through medicine alone. The 1909 hearing that should have settled the legal question at the center of her case instead revealed exactly how far the law itself was willing to bend, once it finally had one specific, powerless person standing in front of it to bend against. Her case did not end with her. The same 1905 ruling her own hearing had leaned on, went on to sit quietly inside American law for the rest of the century, cited again and again whenever a court needed to weigh one person's liberty against a claimed danger to everyone else's health. It did not wait 100 years to surface again. Within a decade of her own death, the country was already fighting the same argument out in public during the influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919, as cities across America ordered churches, theaters, and saloons closed and gatherings banned under exactly the same police power doctrine Jacobson had established. In Los Angeles, members of a Christian Science congregation deliberately defied a closure order to force a test of the law, were arrested, and asked a state court to free them. The court refused, unwilling to cast any doubt on a city's authority to order the closure in the first place. In Idaho the following year, the state's highest court upheld a decision to bar people from voting if a quarantine order kept them from reaching the polls, reasoning that a public health measure could reasonably outweigh even a citizen's access to the ballot. The same basic argument, liberty against collective safety, kept resurfacing every few decades, in new diseases and new courtrooms, without ever being fully settled either way. New York City itself faced exactly this same tension only a few years after Mary Mallon's second confinement began. When influenza reached the city in the fall of 1918, the health commissioner of the day, a physician named Royal Copeland, placed the entire port under quarantine, ordered police officers, firefighters, and street cleaners to wear masks on duty, and enforced staggered business hours across the city for a month to thin out crowding on the subways. He refused, over real public criticism, to close the schools, arguing that a supervised classroom was often a cleaner and safer place for a child than a crowded tenement apartment. Historians, who later compared how dozens of American cities handled that pandemic, found that New York moved faster than nearly all of them to put its public health measures in place. It was the same underlying power the courts had upheld in Mary Mallon's own case a decade earlier. The same argument that an individual's ordinary freedom of movement could be restricted for the collective good, now being exercised at the scale of an entire city rather than one household's cook. The same fight resurfaced again in the 1980s, during the early years of the AIDS epidemic, when panic far outran the actual science and lawmakers in several states floated proposals to quarantine people simply for testing positive for the virus. One ballot measure in California, driven largely by a fringe political movement, would have authorized exactly that kind of mandatory quarantine. None of these proposals became lasting national policy, but the fact that they were seriously proposed at all showed how easily a frightened public could be talked into reaching for Mary Mallon's exact solution against an entirely different disease, decades after her own death. It resurfaced again in 2014, when a nurse named Casey Hickox returned to the United States after treating Ebola patients in West Africa, and was held in a plastic tent outside a New Jersey hospital for days, despite testing negative and showing no symptoms at all. She refused to accept a further quarantine ordered in her home state of Maine, fought it in court, and won the right to move freely while simply monitoring her own symptoms. Her eventual lawsuit forced New Jersey to write down, for the first time in writing, a formal set of rights guaranteed to anyone the state tries to quarantine, including the right to a lawyer, a hearing, and the chance to challenge the order in front of a judge, protections nobody had ever been required to give Mary Mallon at all. It surfaced again, by name, more than 100 years after Mary Mallon's own hearing, in courtrooms arguing over shelter-in-place orders and mask mandates during a modern pandemic, judges across the country reaching for the exact same 1905 language to decide how far a state could go against people it had decided the rest of us needed protecting from, and disagreeing, even now, about exactly where that line should sit. One of those modern cases, argued before the United States Supreme Court in the spring of 2020, asked the justices to decide whether a state could limit attendance at religious gatherings during a public health emergency, and the arguments filed on both sides of that case cited the exact same 1905 ruling Mary Mallon's own attorney had once tried and failed to overcome. The justices split, as courts across the country continued to split for years afterward, over how much weight a century-old public health ruling should still carry against an individual's claimed rights in a modern emergency. Nobody arguing those cases was thinking about a cook from County Tyrone. But the legal question underneath both moments was, in the end, the very same one. How much of one person's liberty can a frightened state take in the name of protecting everyone else, before that protection becomes its own kind of harm? Legal scholars had already been revisiting the old ruling long before that case ever reached the court. A widely read law review article published in the spring of 2008, more than a decade before any of this, was already asking what a, quote, 21st century Jacobson, unquote, might need to look like, arguing that a rule built in 1905 for a world of smallpox vaccination and municipal quarantine boats was never designed to answer every version of the same question a modern pandemic might raise. When new legal challenges arrived by the hundreds during the pandemic of the 2020s, judges across the federal court system openly disagreed about how much weight that century-old reasoning should still carry, with some treating it as settled and controlling, and others arguing that a modern constitutional analysis had simply outgrown it. The debate her own case had first forced into a courtroom was, by then, still not settled by anyone. The very term the public reached for during that same pandemic, an asymptomatic spreader, a person capable of transmitting a serious illness while feeling completely well themselves, describes exactly the medical category Mary Mallon's own case had forced American doctors to reckon with for the first time. Epidemiologists, teaching that concept in the 2020s, frequently reached back to her case specifically, not because the biology of a virus and a bacterium have much in common, but because the basic ethical puzzle is identical. What does a society owe, and what can it demand, from a person whose only offense is the invisible content of their own body? Mary Mallon's own case did not exist in isolation. It sat at the start of a much longer, much wider argument that the rest of the century would keep having, in different courtrooms, against different bodies, under the same basic legal authority that first closed around her in 1907. The whole apparatus that eventually closed around Mary Mallon had a name centuries older than her own case, and an origin far from New York. The word itself comes from the Venetian quarantina, meaning 40 days, the length of time Venice's authorities settled on, in the 13 and 1400s, for holding ships and travelers offshore before letting them into a city terrified of plague. 40 days was not a precise medical calculation. It was close enough, learned through repeated trial, and it carried a certain religious weight besides, 40 being the length of Lent and of the flood in the book of Genesis. By the time that word crossed the Atlantic and settled into American law, it had already been protecting cities for 5 centuries. The Venetian system itself was built around a specific island rather than an abstract rule. Ships arriving from ports with known outbreaks were required to anchor offshore at a facility called a lazaretto, named for the leper hospital of St. Lazarus that had once stood nearby, where passengers, crew, and cargo alike waited out the 40 days before anyone was allowed to set foot in the city proper. Goods thought capable of carrying plague, cloth and furs especially, were aired out, fumigated with smoke, or simply left in the sun for the same stretch of time. It was a crude system, by modern medical standards, built on centuries of observed pattern, rather than any understanding of germs, and it was also, by the numbers Venice kept on its own outbreaks, one of the more effective public health interventions anywhere in the world for the better part of 500 years. The idea that a state could compel a person's body to wait, alone, outside the ordinary life of a city, for the safety of everyone else inside it, is close to 1,000 years old. What changed by the time it reached Mary Mallon's own case was not the underlying idea. It was the fact that the person being made to wait was no longer a passenger who could see land on the horizon and count down 40 days until she reached it. She had no fixed number of days to count toward, and no ship of similar passengers waiting out the same sentence beside her. Only 9 years before Mary Mallon's own habeas corpus hearing, that same quarantine power had already been tested and beaten in a San Francisco courtroom. In March of 1900, city health officials responded to the country's first confirmed case of bubonic plague by roping off several blocks of Chinatown, and only Chinatown, with a boundary that critics quickly noticed did not follow any street in a straight line. It curved around white-owned businesses and ran straight through Chinese-owned ones, so that white residents inside the same blocks could come and go freely, while their Chinese neighbors could not leave at all. A grocer named Ju Ho, trapped inside that line, sued to have it lifted. In June of 1900, a federal court agreed with him, ruling that the quarantine was unreasonable, unjust, oppressive, and openly discriminatory, and struck it down. A public health measure, in other words, could be challenged and defeated in an American courtroom when a court was willing to look closely at who exactly it was being enforced against and why. 9 years later, when Mary Mallon's own lawyer made a related argument, no court extended her the same scrutiny. The San Francisco outbreak had its own ugly prologue. City boosters and the state's own governor spent months publicly denying that plague existed in the city at all, worried about the effect the word alone would have on trade and tourism, a denial that delayed any real response and likely let the disease spread further than an honest early acknowledgement would have allowed. The federal quarantine officer who first drew the Chinatown boundary, a bacteriologist named Joseph Quignon, had already provoked lawsuits of his own before Ju Ho's case, including one attempt to require anyone leaving Chinatown to submit to an experimental, largely untested vaccine, a plan a federal judge blocked outright. Quignon was eventually reassigned out of the city amid the backlash. It is a useful contrast to keep in mind. A public health official who overreached against an entire community faced real, immediate legal and professional consequences within the same year. A single cook, confined for the rest of her working life a few years later, never got the benefit of that same scrutiny. The same police power doctrine Jacobson had established, and Mary Mallon's own case had leaned on, went on to reach far darker ground within a generation. In 1927, the Supreme Court heard the case of a Virginia woman named Carrie Buck, whom the state wanted to sterilize under a law targeting people it classified as unfit. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing for an 8-1 majority, reached directly for Jacobson v. Massachusetts as his precedent, reasoning that if a state could compel vaccination for the public good, it could compel sterilization on the same logic. He closed his opinion with a line that has followed the case ever since: 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That ruling helped enable the sterilization of more than 60,000 Americans across more than 30 states over the following decades, most of them poor, disabled, or otherwise judged inconvenient by the state, before the practice was finally wound down in the 1970s. Mary Mallon's own case never went that far. Nobody proposed sterilizing her, but the same legal reasoning that kept her on an island for 26 years is the reasoning Holmes reached for, 20 years later, to justify something considerably worse. Carrie Buck's own history makes the Supreme Court's reasoning in her case harder to accept the more closely it is examined. She had been committed to a Virginia state institution as a teenager after becoming pregnant, the result of an assault by a relative of the foster family raising her, and family members appear to have used a diagnosis of feeble-mindedness to explain away the pregnancy rather than the assault itself. Her own infant daughter was briefly examined by a nurse who judged the child slow for her age, testimony the court leaned on heavily, even though the same daughter went on, before her early death from an unrelated illness, to make her school's honor roll. Carrie Buck's own attorney, by most later accounts, mounted only a token defense, appearing to cooperate more with the state's goal of establishing a clean test case than with his own client's interest in avoiding the operation. The ruling itself has never been formally overturned by the Supreme Court, even though it is now almost universally treated as one of the court's most discredited decisions. Confinement on the grounds of contagious disease alone, meanwhile, was already happening to far more people than Mary Mallon, on a scale her own case never approached. Beginning in 1866, the Kingdom of Hawaii, and later the American territorial government that replaced it, forcibly removed anyone diagnosed with leprosy, a disease now called Hansen's disease, to a remote peninsula named Kalaupapa, cut off from the rest of the island of Molokai by cliffs nearly 2,000 feet high. Something close to 8,000 people passed through that settlement over the better part of a century, most of them taken from their families by law, some of them children. On the American mainland, a leprosarium at Carville, Louisiana, opened in the 1890s and was taken over by the federal government in 1917, eventually housing as many as 500 patients at a time. Neither institution operated under anything resembling a criminal sentence. Patients were held, sometimes for the rest of their lives, purely on the basis of a diagnosis. Exactly the same legal logic applied to Mary Mallon, but applied to thousands of people rather than one, for decades longer than her own confinement ran. Hawaii did not end the law forcing removal of leprosy patients until 1969, 31 years after Mary Mallon's own death, and patients had only been allowed to leave Kalaupapa freely from that year onward. Effective treatment for the disease had existed since the 1940s. The law took another 2.5 decades to catch up to the medicine. Life inside a leprosy settlement carried its own severe, specific rules, distinct from anything imposed on Mary Mallon. At Kalaupapa, healthy infants born to patients were routinely taken from their parents within days of birth and sent elsewhere to be raised by relatives or strangers, out of fear the disease would pass between parent and child, a separation many families never fully recovered from. A Belgian priest named Father Damien arrived at the settlement in the 1870s to minister to patients living there, eventually contracted the disease himself, and died at Kalaupapa in 1889, a death that drew international attention to conditions most Americans preferred not to think about. Patients in the settlement's earliest decades were sometimes recorded and buried under numbers rather than names, an erasure of identity considerably more literal than anything done to Mary Mallon, whose name, if anything, survived far too well. A different mechanism entirely, exclusion rather than confinement, produced its own landmark fight only a few decades after Mary Mallon's death. In 1985, a 13-year-old Indiana boy named Ryan White, who had contracted AIDS through a tainted blood treatment for his hemophilia, was barred from his own middle school once his diagnosis became known. After more than 100 parents and dozens of teachers signed a petition demanding it, the disease could not spread through ordinary classroom contact. Doctors said so repeatedly and publicly, and the exclusion held anyway for months while the family pursued appeals. A hearing officer and then a state appeals board eventually ruled that he could return once a local health officer certified him fit to attend, which happened in February of 1986. Even after he won, the school required him to eat with disposable utensils and use a separate bathroom, and someone fired a bullet through the family's living room window, driving them to move to a different town entirely. Ryan White himself died in April of 1990, 5 years into his own fight, at 18 years old. Congress passed a law bearing his name only months later, the Ryan White Care Act, creating the country's largest federal program dedicated to HIV care. A program that has since grown from an initial budget of a few $100 million to well over $2 billion a year, and that one estimate credits with saving something like 57,000 lives through direct medical support alone. It is one of the few threads in this entire wider pattern that produce something closer to a happy ending. A boy excluded from his own classroom became, after his death, the reason hundreds of thousands of strangers with the same disease got consistent access to care. Mary Mallon's own confinement produced no comparable law bearing her name, no fund, no program. It produced a nickname, and eventually, decades later, a small handful of newspaper columns and law review footnotes asking what her case actually meant. American law was rewritten with cases exactly like hers in mind only a few years later, in response to a different alarm entirely. Letters laced with anthrax spores, mailed to news organizations and government offices in the fall of 2001, in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks, killed 5 people and pushed lawmakers to confront how unprepared American public health law actually was for a deliberate, large-scale biological threat. A legal scholar named Lawrence Gostin drafted a model statute, the Model State Emergency Health Powers Act, finished within months and circulated to every state legislature by the end of that same year, giving governors and health departments sweeping new authority to order isolation, quarantine, and even forced treatment during a declared emergency. Civil liberties groups objected immediately, warning that the model law let a governor declare an emergency alone, without a judge's involvement, and gave people held under it few of the due process protections Mary Mallon's own case had at least forced into the open a century earlier. By 2011, roughly 40 states had passed some version of that model law, and the debate over how much of it went too far, or not nearly far enough, was still running when the next real test arrived. The World Health Organization revised its own international health regulations in 2005, largely in direct response to an outbreak in Toronto, requiring member countries for the first time to report certain disease events within a set number of hours and to build minimum quarantine and surveillance capacity at their own borders. Mary Mallon's own case predates every one of these international agreements by almost exactly a century. None of the officials who wrote them were thinking about her specifically. All of them were still wrestling with the same basic question her own habeas corpus lawyer had raised in 1909 and lost. Who gets to decide when one person's freedom is worth less than everyone else's safety? And who checks that decision once it has been made? A single city came closer than any American case ever has to repeating Mary Mallon's confinement at a genuinely mass scale. In the spring of 2003, a severe respiratory illness called SARS spread through a Toronto hospital and out into the wider city, and public health authorities responded by placing more than 15,000 people under quarantine, most of them in their own homes, wearing masks around their own families for days or weeks at a stretch. Ontario declared a public health emergency, gave officials the power to track and restrict anyone who might be infectious, and enforced it at a scale no American city had approached since Mary Mallon's own era. A later survey of people who went through that quarantine found close to a third showing signs of depression, and nearly as many showing signs of post-traumatic stress, a rare piece of hard psychological data on exactly the kind of isolation the historical record can only describe secondhand for Mary Mallon herself. The federal government did not attempt anything resembling Mary Mallon's own forced isolation again. For decades after North Brother Island's Riverside Hospital finally closed in 1963. That changed in 2007, when a personal injury lawyer named Andrew Speaker, diagnosed with a drug-resistant strain of tuberculosis, flew to Europe for his own wedding against his doctor's advice, and then flew back into the country through Canada after health officials asked him not to. He became the first American placed under a federal quarantine order since Riverside Hospital's own era, isolated and treated at a hospital in Denver rather than an island in the East River, but held by the exact same underlying legal authority Mary Mallon's own case had once tested in a New York courtroom. Speaker later sued the federal government over how his case had been handled, a lawsuit that was dismissed, revived on appeal, and dismissed again. He was, unlike Mary Mallon, released once his treatment succeeded, free to return to an ordinary life and a law practice of his own. The power that held him for a matter of weeks was the same power that held her for 26 years. What changed between her case and his was never really the law. It was who the law was being used against, and how loudly the public was watching by the time it happened. Andrew Speaker's own return to the United States exposed a specific, embarrassing gap in the same government machinery that had once confined Mary Mallon. Border agents at a crossing near Champlain, New York, had been alerted to watch for him and deny him entry. Yet the agent who actually checked his passport saw the alert, recognized his name, and let him through the border anyway, a decision the government was never able to fully explain afterward. The episode triggered a wave of national media coverage, congressional hearings into the communication failure between the Centers for Disease Control and the Department of Homeland Security, and a formal review of how quarantine orders were actually transmitted and enforced at the country's borders, a level of scrutiny of its own conduct that no health department official ever applied to its own handling of Mary Mallon's case, then or in the century afterward. Seen against this wider record, Mary Mallon's own case stops looking like an isolated overreaction to a frightening new discovery, and starts looking like the point where a still-forming legal doctrine first touched down on an actual, specific, powerless person. Every one of these later cases either extended that same doctrine further, as Buck v. Bell did, applied it more broadly and for far longer, as Kalopapa and Carville did, or found unexpected limits to it, as the Chinatown quarantine case did, 9 years before her own hearing, and Kotze Hickox's lawsuit did a century afterward. Mary Mallon never got the benefit of a court finding her particular quarantine unreasonable, unjust, or discriminatory, the way Ju Ho did. She never lived to see the disease that had defined her own case become curable, the way Kalopapa's patients eventually saw happen to theirs. She simply absorbed, alone and for longer than almost anyone else the record can name, the exact same authority the state would go on to use, refine, restrain, and occasionally abuse against countless other bodies for the rest of the century. Taken together, These cases sketch a rough shape to the century that followed Mary Mallon's own confinement, a shape her own story sits at the very start of. The same police power that held her went on, at different moments and in different hands, to sterilize tens of thousands of Americans who had committed no crime, to hold thousands of leprosy patients for decades on a remote Hawaiian peninsula, to bar a sick 13-year-old from an Indiana classroom, to quarantine 15,000 Canadians in their own homes during a single spring, to survive a direct legal challenge from a Chinatown grocer 9 years before it ever reached her, and to fail, embarrassingly, at a single American border crossing in 2007, when the one man it was supposed to stop simply walked through. No single thread runs cleanly through all of it. The power has been used against the powerless far more often than against the powerful, exactly as Judith Walzer-Levitt's own reading of Mary Mallon's case would predict. But it has also, on occasion, been checked, narrowed, and successfully resisted by a grocer in 1900, by a family in Indiana in the 1980s, by a nurse in New Jersey in 2014. Mary Mallon's own case fell on the wrong side of nearly every one of those outcomes. She was never granted the legal victory Ju Ho won. She was never given the institutional support Frederick Morsch received on his own release. She was never treated with the ordinary caution a school board eventually extended to Ryan White. She simply absorbed the fullest, least examined version of a power that the following century would spend 100 years arguing about, refining, and, every so often, using just as badly against someone else. That is precisely why her case still gets taught today, in public health schools and bioethics courses that have nothing else in common with a Manhattan courtroom in 1909. Scholars still genuinely disagree about her, some reading her as a clear victim of prejudice, others insisting the danger she posed was real enough to justify most of what was done to her. And the honest truth is that the record supports pieces of both readings without fully resolving into either one. That disagreement is not a failure of the historical record. It is the actual, permanent shape of the question her case first forced into an American courtroom, and it has never gone away since. Her name has also long since stopped belonging only to her. A comic book publisher borrowed it decades later for a supervillain with nothing to do with typhoid or New York. Playwrights have staged her story more than once, imagining conversations with her that no transcript ever recorded. A novelist gave her back a full interior voice in a work of fiction published in the 21st century, imagining the private thoughts the historical record never preserved. None of those later versions are evidence of anything about the actual woman. They are evidence of something else entirely, of how completely a frightened nickname coined in a medical journal in 1908 went on to replace the person it was originally describing, in the popular imagination, for more than 100 years afterward. Mary Mallon spent 26 years on that island, the last dish she is known to have prepared, working quietly under a name that was never actually hers, was, by every surviving account, entirely ordinary. It always had been. That, in the end, was the whole of the problem this story ever really turned on. Nothing about her ever looked like a danger, not to the families who hired her summer after summer, not to the woman standing at the stove herself. Only the record, once somebody with a notebook finally went looking hard enough, ever said otherwise.